Okay, today I want to continue with William James as the second major figure in pragmatism. Unlike Peirce, James was a well-known figure, not only nationally but internationally, and he was the author of many books. And at the turn of the 20th century, he was one of the most well-known academics anywhere in the world. He had an international reputation. He was fluent in French and German, so he could, when he went to Europe, he could participate in intellectual discussions there. And his works had considerable influence in the French and German language academies, as well as in the English language academy. He began teaching at Harvard in 1872 as an assistant professor of physiology, having finished his medical training. He then, however, started the first psychological laboratory and began doing a series of experiments related to what makes sentient beings tick. Some of the research was done, a lot of the research was done with Harvard and Radcliffe undergrads, just like it's done still today, but he also did a lot of research with dogs, with frogs, with worms. He went down the list. His first book was Principles of Psychology, which the edition I have is something like, well, 1,300 pages. The original edition, probably more white space, was 2 volumes, 1,800 pages total. He began writing it in 1878. It was published in 1890. It was initially going to be a summary of what the status of psychological thought was, and be used as an introductory textbook in universities. But instead, it grew and grew and grew to become this more extensive survey of extant ideas about thinking and consciousness, and comparing the various theories of how the brain functioned with what laboratory research was revealing, not only in his laboratory, but also laboratories in other parts of the country or in Europe. And one of the reasons the book is as long as it is because his research, he had to argue that pretty much every idea about how the mind functioned that had been argued in either physiology or philosophy had to be wrong if the psychological studies that he and others had conducted had any validity. He was particularly critical of both Lockean and Scottish common sense ideas about how the mind works and conceptions of reason, and he just had to give dozens and dozens of practical examples of why this could not be the case. He was also particularly critical of mechanistic or deterministic views of how mind functioned or consciousness functioned, physiological views. And again, he had practical examples. He came to the conclusion that, in fact, choice was a fundamental aspect of sentient being and could not be explained, that choices could not be explained by any kind of deterministic model. And okay, human beings are complex, so you do experiments in which you're trying to be able to predict what a frog will do in any number of a half dozen different situations. And then you determine that you can't really predict what the frog will do, that the frog itself has some options that escape predetermination. Okay, so you go down to tapeworms and you study how tapeworms operate in situations where there are choices that they have to make. And again, choice seems to be inevitable. Now, if you think of this in terms of later 20th century thought about chaos theory, indeterminacy is simply a part of how things are structured in the universe. Peirce would explain that in terms of this of existence being this continuous series of exchanges. So of course, the exchanges are based on encounters. They're based on the specific context of the interrelationships. So there's an indeterminacy built in. Yes, you can predict outcomes in very limited circumstances where every aspect of the situation is known and controlled. The problem is in real life, even at the very simple molecular or atomic levels, things are not so easily predictable. And then when you deal with behavior, with psychological phenomena, you have a situation where you can't simply arrive at a clear predictive model for why people are going to behave the way they do. That doesn't mean you can't explain things, but you can't explain it according to a predictive theory, a theory with predictive structure. So he needed these many, many chapters in order to be able to demolish what had been the existing set of debates between idealists and mechanists over the nature of psychological reality. And then at the same time, he could not present an alternative model of this is how the mind works in this situation, and that situation. It was a series of indeterminacies that he wanted to present. Now, he had some particular conclusions, which I'll go into, because they have to do with the sort of fundamental categories that he used. And most of his most important work is based in Principles of Psychology, which is actually a quite delightful, readable book. James has the virtue of being one of the best stylists in the English language. His brother was Henry James, the novelist, so he had some competition, though he always thought that writers should write in order to be able to be understood. So he did not always like the way his brother had these vague, suggestive plays with language. They had a close relationship, possibly because Henry, the younger brother, lived in England almost all of his adult life, so they could just exchange letters continuously without ever having to have to get into the messiness of face-to-face contact. So he published Principles of Psychology in 1890. It became actually surprisingly an overnight success. It had been much anticipated, certainly by scientists, because James had been publishing articles throughout the 80s. And it was quickly translated into all the major European languages and into Japanese. Then James prepared the actual textbook, something that could be assigned in a college undergraduate class, Psychology Briefer Course, which is about 400 pages, has much of the same sort of kind of delightful imagery that's in Principles of Psychology, but he doesn't have to demonstrate all the foundations of his arguments, and he makes a clearer case about how he thinks the current set of evidence suggests mind functions. Following that, he also did a book, Talks to Teachers on Psychology and to Students on Some of Life's Ideals, which was published in 1899, which for a generation was the most widely used parent manual for how to raise your children for middle-class Anglo-Americans. And that made him buckets of money because every middle-class professional had a kid, wanted to have a copy of the book so they would learn, get a better insight about how to raise their children. The Will to Believe and Other Essays in Popular Philosophy was the first book where he made his move from psychology to philosophy per se, to how we know things and what are the moral foundations of a good life. And there he laid many of the, developed his ideas in terms that weren't confined by psychological research, and that would then take shape in pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking, which was a series of lectures he gave in 1906 in Boston, Massachusetts, to an auditorium of 3,000 people each time. And then it was published, in which he laid out in a concise way the basic principles of pragmatism. Before then, he had published another series of lectures that he had given in Scotland called The Varieties of Religious Experience, a Study in Human Nature. He wanted to look at the biological and psychological functions of religion. Now, scientists thought that he was trying to defend the place of religion in modern life. However, when I looked at book reviews that were done in religious journals, this book was considered anathema because he was reducing religious feelings to a biological substrate. And the reviewers were aware that James was somehow or other considered to be a friend of religion, but they one after another would say, this is not a friend that we want. This was one of the things that gave me the idea that maybe it's a good idea to look at book reviews, have students look at book reviews, because you can see that there are conflicting opinions, and depending on where people come from, you can develop better insight into the book. In Varieties of Religious Experience, he did two things that I think are most important. One is he developed, in the most complex way that he did in his life, his theory of the divided soul, or consciousness as essentially being a conflict between expectations and realities, that there is no single set of pattern behavior within a person. There are learned behaviors, but because people are complex and contradictory inside, their behavior is actually often contradictory, and they choose to do things, or they choose things that if you had been observing them for a while, you wouldn't think that they would have done based on those previous observations. The other important argument that he made in Varieties of Religious Experience was that religion developed essentially as a way of intellectualizing about the elements of the universe that people didn't know anything about. And therefore it was a place where there were all these what he called liminal experiences, so things that are happening to you for which you don't really have a means of explanation. And therefore, religion had receded before science as more and more things were explained. But he argued that didn't mean that religion would become less important, as some scientists were saying, or that religion would be replaced by science. On the contrary, he said that as science and technology become more and more important, the place of religion in people's lives will grow significantly, and that religion will become an increasingly important factor in modern life through the 20th century because it will be the place where people can articulate their reactions against and their opposition to the kind of modernist centralizing power that was developing in the world as nation states were expanding their abilities to monitor and control their populations, and as modern corporations were expanding their ability to produce and distribute products. I think it was a prediction that, in fact, proved to be quite accurate. Then after pragmatism, he produced 3 books, which were essentially his unfinished experiments in what he called radical empiricism. Radical empiricism is basically an argument on his part that beyond language, there's something that the body experiences in its interactions with other reals that is as important as anything that language presents to us. And that science needed to break away from its obsession with logic and predictability and become more aware of the indeterminacy of the world, particularly in the ways in which reals might be playing out in the world in ways that current scientific thinking couldn't comprehend. And that if thinking about the body as a source of knowledge would be an important way of getting at something that was separate from what language taught us. This is all too brief, but let's go to some of the key words in his version of pragmatism. First is the real, in which he and Peirce use the real in synonymous ways, essentially, as they do the hypothetical. That is, something is a hypothetical when we are considering whether we should do something or not. It's not simply, is something possibly true? In order for something to be considered seriously, there has to be an action attached to it. Then for James, this word experience was central. Experience was a representation of the reals we had encountered and the responses it generated from us, and that our responses generated from it. Experience was a first level reflection about things that had happened to us in the past. It was not synonymous with the things that happened to us in the past. Experience is always in the present, reflecting on the events, interactions that occurred previously. And as such, experience is something that takes place in signs. You can't go back in time. You can't have the events replay themselves. What you do is go through your ordering of those events, your synthesis of those events. And that experience becomes a first level set of conclusions about what those events meant. When you think that something means something, then and you're ready to act with conviction based on this reflection about events in the past, the experience, next abstraction from experience is what James referred to as the true or truth. For James, truth is any determination upon which we're ready to act. This was, for the critics of James, the single most shocking thing that he said, though there were plenty of things that he said that shocked his critics. Because the true in classical philosophy is a priori. It always was, and it always will be. It isn't something that reflects our subjective interpretation. But for James, the true is simply a preliminary determination about the state of one's relationships with things surrounding you that are about which you're convinced enough that you will buy the airplane ticket and actually get on the airplane. You have a feeling that that is not a dangerous thing to do. Though in 1907, it would have been a gamble under the best of circumstances. Today, it's still a gamble, but we assume that it's true that the people running airplanes know what they're doing. So meaning, in this, whenever James talks about the meaning of something, he's talking about the consequences of it. You judge the truth of the truth claim by looking at the consequences. Any questions about this? So far, it's mostly consistent with Peirce, but there are some differences that made Peirce very uncomfortable. This is the definition for true that James gave in Pragmatism. It's all part of this operational exchange process. This does not mean, in any sense, that something's true because it makes you feel good, which has been was one of the criticisms and remains one of the criticisms, that this is about how you feel. On the contrary, it's how you feel after you've actually had to live with the consequences of what you've done. And that it's those consequences that are critical. So to come back to truth. Truth, thus, is a commitment to a proposition that you're going to test through action. You think that it's highly likely that if you do a certain experimental process, you will discover neutrinos. And so you take the time and the money and you set up those experimental conditions. If you didn't think that it was highly likely, you probably wouldn't get the money to set up the conditions to begin with. So there has to be an argument as to why you think the conclusion, your proposition, has a good degree of probability to it. Now, as part of truth, he then proceeded into a critique of science as a system of thought, which is articulated throughout principles of psychology, which is there's a process, as we engage with the world, there's a process of abstractions that creatures make, tapeworms as well as human beings, about the environment in which they live. those abstractions become the basis for further interactions. In human beings, those abstractions become formalized propositions about water or air or any phenomenon. It's based on incomplete knowledge, because there's no way that any group of human beings can have complete knowledge of the reals with which it's interacting. But in order to get something done, you often have to act as if you had complete knowledge. And logic developed as a way of figuring out the connections between the things that you know, that take the things that you don't know and make them less of a problem. And so it essentially is doing an extrapolation from things that you know to act as if the universe, or whatever this aspect of the universe, if the universe is perfect according to the knowledge, then it must operate like so. Does that make sense? I probably didn't express it very well. It's acting as if you had absolute knowledge when you only have partial knowledge. But if you wait till you have absolute knowledge to do something, you'll never do it, because it's an impossibility to get absolute knowledge. Therefore, in order to do anything, you have to make some assumptions that are extrapolated from the partial knowledge that you have. Some of your assumptions will, in fact, prove to be right. A lot will prove to be wrong. It's okay to be wrong. It's in the process of doing something that you couldn't do before that you have more sophisticated, more intense interactions with the world around you, and you learn more. So then you correct your logic. The problem with science, for all sorts, in science, it's not the problem with science, it's a problem in science, is oftentimes scientists, for a variety of reasons, some personal, some institutional, don't want to let go of abstractions that they made previously. They don't want to admit that they were wrong, and thus they fight the revision of the knowledge that they have helped establish. And they often do so on the basis of the infallibility of logic. So this was a fundamental assault on an aspect of scientific privilege and power in order to make science more fluid. Part of this is a reflection of James's belief that there must always be choice in a situation, and not simply an illusion of choice, but a real choice. So, and he was, as far as we know, the first person who proposed that depression is a product of a sense of powerlessness, of an inability to be able to make a choice. So something is true for you because it expands your ability as a choice maker. It expands your capability. And thus, knowledge that freezes response, by definition, is not only impractical, it also can't be right. Because in a universe, in a triadic universe in which everything is based on interactions, there has to be fluidity in the interactions. There can't just be an automatic result to any given interaction. So it is true that for him, truth, thus for human beings in the human sphere, truth always takes the form of a subjective process, of a feeling that one is in a more adequate, more empowered relationship with the world in which you're living. Truth is not an a priori essence that's always existed before time and will exist after time, as classical philosophy argued, nor is it a mathematical relationship of signs, as Peirce argued. And Peirce became quite agitated about James's insistence on the subjective aspects of truth and wrote an essay in 1905 attacking James's approach because it did not follow the logical requirements of how things should be. And he proposed that his version of pragmatism be called pragmaticism, but that didn't go anywhere. So the consequences, again, are signs. They're evidence. They need to be interpreted. The systems of interpretation that you have may help you interpret those consequences correctly, or they may stand in the way. Part of the process of human progress, and certainly James believed in the concept of progress, is this continuous throwing away of previous convictions. So James's, both his psychology and his philosophy is based on putting yourself in an eternally self-critical position in which you are always doubting not only what's presented to you, but doubting how you're interpreting it in order to arrive, and also doubting the systems of interpretation that you've received, that you put yourself into a position of radical criticism. For many, this was a very liberating position to take and seemed to eliminate many of the obstacles to thinking about old problems in new ways. So in practical terms, one of the reasons he was so popular was that there was a growing professional middle class, which was operating in highly bureaucratic situations, but which was also supposed to be whose privileges, whose income, whose power rested on their ability, their supposed ability to be in command of abstract knowledge, and their ability to be disinterested, quote unquote, and to provide an informed objective opinion. James seemed to provide a way of, James's formulation of pragmatism seemed to provide a way that one could operate in a bureaucratic world and still be an independent critical thinker. Now, it's a continuum, so in some situations, you're just a conformist. In other situations, you're more, you become a gadfly. The influence was pervasive. So if I take Alfred Lloyd, who's the first graduate dean at any American university, and who set up the sort of basic structures of graduate PhD programs as we now understand them. Graduate student who had worked with James, went to the University of Michigan, became appointed the dean of the graduate division, and set about thinking about how do you create a PhD program that's based on the idea that all valid knowledge has got to be useful knowledge, that it's not, that it has to improve people's lives, that knowledge is not abstract, it's always something that's brought back into society. And that is what the PhD program is supposed to be about. Anyone who has a PhD has got to learn how to be the bridge between past knowledge and future accomplishment. But it also was something that was important in civil rights movements. in the women's movement, in the arts, where the arts became a way of critically examining experience. So James could be a guardian, a authorizing figure for very conservative impulses in American society. But he could also be, and also was, an authorizing figure for radical, progressive, critical tendencies within American society. But again, pragmatism was not about a particular ideology. It was about conceptualizing a relationship between a knowing subject and a mostly unknown world around one, with the basic idea that every idea is simply a working proposition, and that science is the sequencing of a series of working propositions, and that science works best the more it critiques and gets rid of older ideas. So this will be up on the website so you can take a look at it. So this does directly come from James's understanding of what Peirce was arguing about the semiotic basis of knowledge and being. From James's point of view, he was implementing Peirce's ideas in one practical sphere. It's also based on his Darwinian conception of the place of organisms in their relationship to the environment. That this interaction, from a psychological point of view, is a question of how the organism, a sentient being, as also a biological organism, organizes and controls its relationship to its environment. So he believed that truth ultimately prevails over error because the tensions of your relationship to the environment are reduced if you have knowledge that is relatively more accurate. You have more ability to control that environment. And this was a hypothesis that conformed with his own findings that organisms, whether they be single-celled organisms, worms, frogs, dogs, or undergraduates, responded to the environment with the goal of decreasing tension. Okay. Now, from the concept of truth, when a truth has been confirmed multiple times, it becomes a belief. Now, Peirce used the term belief to mean a collective consensus had formed in a community of inquiry about how to do things or about expected results, and that effective consensus allowed more efficient action to take place. You could figure out how to streamline your activities to get at the desired result. James, of course, had a more subjective definition, which was belief is a conviction that accompanies, fosters and accompanies consistent action. So if you believe something to be true, you do what that belief suggests you should do multiple times, over and over and over again, until eventually you don't even think about it. So what happens, because thought is not simply this abstract logical process that's taking place, because thought takes place in neurological and beings that in which hormonal fluxes are also an important part of how we think, belief turns into habit. This is actually, for the most part, a good thing, because you can do things more easily when you don't think about what you're doing. If you're playing the piano, you actually don't play the piano well until you don't have to think about how to position your hands, how to do the fingering, that you just do it. While you're learning, you're having to go back and forth between your reflection on it and the doing of it. When you drive a car, you don't think about all the various steps that you're doing in driving the car. It's become a habit or habituated behavior. So that is to say that ideas become part of our bodies. Successful ideas that we have found to be successful get integrated into the warp and woof of our bodies. This is a logical consequence of Darwinian stimulus response thinking. It wasn't a radical idea, but he then started to extend it to what does that mean for how people live together? Which is that if our ideas are always part of systems of representation, that is, ways of interpreting the world that we have inherited, the institutions in which they originated shape actually the patterns of our sensation, our sensibilities, our moods. If you remember the James Lange theory of emotions, you're sad because you cry, not you cry because you're sad. So if you've internalized a set of habits, those habits carry along with them, those habituated behaviors carry along with them moods that are associated with them. He also noted that habit is resistant to change. At the individual organism level, it's very difficult to get an organism to change its habit, even when the habit has become dysfunctional in a new environment or a changed environment. Habit is by essence conservative. So in an institutional sense, the habits that underlie human social relations then become an obstacle to critical thought. And indeed, critical thought is viewed as something not just wrong, but threatening, because you're asking people to change their biological being. So systems of representation in James's model become the way in which power is reproduced. Now, for those of you who have read Foucault, this might sound similar. It's because this is part of the genealogy that Foucault himself was very clear about. It's not that he's imitating James or copying him. He's taking James certain trends that propositions that James put into public intellectual life in the Atlantic world at the beginning of the 20th century, and Foucault took them to, for him, the next logical steps. But what James, as part of James's insight into this, is that because of the conservative nature of habit, its resistance to change, when habit gets applied to social institutions, communities fail to adapt to changing circumstances. The circumstances are always changing. Therefore, communities become more dysfunctional in their relationship with each other or into their environment. And it's this encrusted relationship, this ossified relationship to the world that then promotes continuous crisis in human life. And it's only the crises that push people into a situation where they must change because the old habits don't work anymore. And as you know, a frog that cannot change its habits in a pond where a crane or a heron has arrived is going to be an eaten and digested frog. A society that can't change its habits is going to be a society that collapses or become a society that's increasingly unstable and dangerous. And thus habit, and this is, I think, part of the subtlety of James's thought and why it's not simply a question of if it feels good, it's all right. It's that what feels good and what is all right inevitably becomes what ought to feel wrong, and what's going to come and destroy you is going to be your nemesis. That it's your very proclivities that will prevent you from responding to the world in the complex ways and the critical ways that you need to. And for James, the whole purpose of philosophy is to provide people with the critical tools they need to break the chain of habit, break the chain of systems of representation. And for him, it is classical philosophy which provided the most imprisoning form of system of representation. Now, the term system of representation, he adopted, it's the typical translation in English of Kant's term Vorstellungen. And it's a central term to Kantian philosophy, and James adopted it specifically because he wanted people to understand that it was classical philosophy that lay behind the problems they faced in their inability to deal with the problems they faced. Now, maybe this is giving too much credence to classical philosophy or to philosophy in general. But he thought the job of philosophers was to rupture this, to provide the people with the tools they needed to think critically. John Dewey, who we'll talk about on Monday, pursued that aspect of James's thought more dramatically. So it's important to remember that for James, it's not a question of good versus bad. It's a question of habit has these good aspects that allows us to do things. Habit has these bad aspects. How do you retain the good aspects while being aware of the bad aspects? How do you become self-critical enough that you can be aware of what's determining your behavior in a given situation, and that you have to, and what you might have to do to regain control over that determining process. So, yeah. So, in that sense, James was one of the founders, a central founder of radical thought in 20th century United States, which which the second generation, the generation of men and women who became intellectuals in the teens and 20s, often frequently said. So then I suggested that you might look at the chapter at will. I hope you've read at least parts of one of the chapters in Principles of Psychology. But the will then would seem like an important aspect to this whole process. So the will is an important category in classical philosophy. It's the desire for something. It's the necessary condition for action. God in Western philosophy is sometimes defined as was sometimes, and really still is, defined as absolute will, unconditioned and unrestrained. And human beings have a reflection of that will. For classical philosophy and for theology, the function of will in human beings was to go through a process of trial and error so that you would voluntarily embrace truth and submit to God's will. James didn't quite see it that way, but he wasn't a believer in any sense that his contemporaries understood. So in that chapter, he poses the question, what's the source of the will? And he says there are two basic sources to the ability to form a desire to do something. The primary one is learning through imitation. That is, you form your will by imitating the will of others. It's your sense of freedom is part of the system of representation that you've inherited. And you believe that you're free to do something because you've been taught that you're free to do something and that you should do that something, and if you do that something, there will be the desired result. This doesn't sound like much of a free will to me, nor did it sound like much of a free will to James, but he thought this is the free will that we actually deal with on a day-to-day basis. We do things, we want to do things because we think we can do them. And the reason we think we can do them is because we've learned that we can do them, and we've learned that we can do them because we were told we were supposed to want to do them. However, because chaos is always a part of the universe, there's random accidents that occur to you. And something happens that's unexpected, and you survive it. And you've learned, in that improvised response, you've learned that you can do something that you didn't know that you could do previously. This is clearly natural selection applied to the psychological realm. Behaviors, new behaviors that allow you to survive get reproduced. And other people start imitating you because you're obviously being successful doing this new behavior. So chaos or overdetermination, that's the source of free will, which is not a very cheery idea, but that's okay. So it was, you can read this. I mean, this process of how philosophy and psychology should interact is to be able to allow a circuit to develop. So change becomes a normal part of life, a controlled part of life, and not something that emerges from the eruption of chaos into our lives. So, So this is another way of restating it in terms of more Persian language. But applied to social relationships. And thus this comes back to the question of radical empiricism and what can be learned from the body and from experiences that evade the logical structures, the rationales that we've inherited. This also has a lot of overlap with Foucault. That there is something in extreme experiences, in the experiences of the insane, and paranormal, possibly paranormal experiences, in the play of desire that opens people briefly to a fuller understanding of the world, an understanding that is nonverbal. Now, James thought it was pre-verbal. I think more subsequent research would suggest that that's not possible. But there are experiences that have not yet been organized into satisfactory verbal chains, and thus have a flux to them, an interpretive flux, that if pursued might allow you to learn something. This was certainly part of the message that he imbued to, well, we know that this was one of the messages that he imbued to people, to students that he had, such as W.E.B. Du Bois and Alan Locke. You can't escape the embodied state that race has created for you, therefore you have to learn from it. A message that he also was also taken by his women students, of which there were many, in part because he was one of a small handful of professors at Harvard who would accept women PhD students. Any questions? Is this all abundantly clear or just clear enough? So for those in the academy who were concerned about the status of theory and logic, this was a very unsatisfactory set of conclusions. In the Harvard philosophy department, where James was a member, the response was to give much more, of his colleagues, was actually to say, no, this is not real philosophy, this is ethics. Real philosophy is about mathematical representation of reality. And so philosophy began professionalizing itself in the United States, in part in response to James, by playing down the interpretive debates that philosophers had been engaged in. How do you explain good in the presence of evil in a world created by an all-knowing good being? And became a question of how do you represent the world in absolutely logical terms that are coherent and will allow you to judge, make a judgment as to the adequacy of any given representation. Mathematical logic, propositional logic became a critical response within the philosophy field to what James was doing. One of the ironies of this was that much of the foundations for propositional logic at the time lay in Peirce's work. And so the person who was ultimately responsible for this heinous outcome had to be the person who would provide the tools for countering the chaos that pragmatism represented to many. Okay, I've already said all of this. And James responded by advancing a doctrine of philosophical pluralism, claiming that the United States and the Western world had been dominated by monistic ideas, that is, the search for the one true key, the ring that will bind them all. That in fact, and that this just led to the continued ossification to systems of representation, which appeared attractive as when they first arrived, but which ultimately would prove unable to adapt to changing circumstances. Being essentially, in actual terms, he wasn't an atheist, but he was a polytheist. He believed in polytheism, and the religion that he liked the most was that of ancient Greece and Rome, if he was going to be religious, which oftentimes he wasn't sure that he needed to be. So that pluralism, a plural view of the world, was for him a logical proposition of pragmatism. That truth is always multiple. In any given time, there are even contradictory truths at play in the world, which are not, they might be contradictory at the logical level, but they both work in the areas where they're applied, and therefore they have to be accepted as truths. What we don't have yet is the key that will understand what connects them, what explains the apparent contradiction. The contradiction is the problem of our inadequacy of knowledge, not that the representations in the given circumstances are necessarily wrong. And he also thought that pluralism was inherent to U.S. democracy. However, because even though it was inherent in the experience of democracy, monism had retained its power, and therefore it was this distorting factor in American life. James, because he became somewhat of a celebrity, his opinions were asked on a whole host of things about which he himself said he had no knowledge that was worth anything, and so it was a waste of time for people to ask him, but they asked anyway. Thus he became, at times, an intervener in public affairs. At the beginning of the Philippines War, when the United States had occupied the Philippines after the end of the war with Spain, and it set about to crush an already existent independence movement, James became vice chair of the Anti-Imperialist League and an active spokesperson against the U.S. invasion. And the argument he made was always, and he made it over and over again, was couched in terms of the question of, was U.S. democracy the one and only way to arrive at a democratic life? And that because truth is multiple, is plural, each people was going to have to define for itself what the form of democratic interaction was that was most meaningful for the people living in a country and given its history. And that each people had to be allowed the freedom to work through the contradictions of their history, of their own relationships, and find out what would be the formal organizations that would best represent the consent of the governed. In Pragmatism, in the lectures, James argued that monism was something that the elites of the United States and Britain and other countries adopted because they wanted to constrain themselves. They feared their own lack of capability, their own grasp of the truth. And thus the idea that underlying these hierarchical and power-laden institutions was self-contempt, that the leaders of any given nation hate themselves. And thus they can't, that self-hatred thus guides the countries in a variety of negative ways and prevents the countries from actually addressing how do you change bad behaviors. Now, I think, the United States has been in war continuously since 1940. So it seems like we have developed a war habit. And yet it seems, and we know that it has negative consequences on our relationships with other countries and on our economy, on social equity, on the investments we make, and yet we don't seem to be able to address this other than to say, gee, maybe we should have better relations with the rest of the world. It is, I think, a practical illustration of the kinds of things that indeed James was worried about. He also, in 1891, he was one of the first prominent whites in the North who was not associated with the civil rights movement to speak out publicly against the lynching epidemic that was spreading across the South. And he argued that President Harrison at the time should just use his executive powers, send the army into the South where there were lynchings, arrest people, have court-martials, and hang several dozen people who were guilty. And that this might, in fact, if the federal government did this enough, the lynchers, the potential lynchers in the South would change their habits pretty quickly. So thus, one has to say that James is responsible for, has to take responsibility for the many sins of relativism and pluralism that conservatives today say that the university is the center of. And he would not have denied the charge because relativism to him was a logical way of describing the world as it actually existed. And that perhaps because of the complexity of US social life, pluralism and relativism became more visible as actually the way that people lived with each other on the ground. And that monism was antithetical in all of its forms to democracy. Another idea that Dewey will pursue and we'll follow up on. Now, in the last year of his life, he gave a talk which was then published as an essay called The Moral Equivalent of War, which I think remains interesting. It was quite evident to anybody who was reading the newspapers by 1910 that a world war was going to happen. Nobody knew whether it was going to be 1911 or 1920, but it was on its way. And it was also evident that the next war was going to be very bloody, as it proved to be. And while leaders said the next war would not be so bloody because it would be very short, they were proved to be wrong about that. So James, at the invitation of Jane Addams, gave a presentation in which he said, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a political scientist, I don't know anything of any value about how governments work, but I am a psychologist. So I will share with you what I've learned from psychology as it might apply to war. The problem is that, that moral arguments about war were essentially useless. They made people making those arguments feel good, but they never affected anything. So he said they're essentially the equivalent of people praying for rain in a drought. So you have to then look at what is the habituated behavior and what are the social values from that habituated behavior that are associated with war. Now he may not, it's a short article and I'm not sure that he had a real analysis of what militarism does to people. But it was proceeding on the grounds that all societies are organized around systems of representation. Those systems of representation are not simply ideas, but they're embodied concepts of yourself, your ideal self, and what you should be doing, who your friends are and who your enemies are. And thus, they're difficult to root out because they're not simply ideas to be debated. They're ideas that are inside people's bodies and take a form that is a proclivity to do something, regardless of what you might even say you believe. Everyone who is involved in war will say that it's a terrible thing and it should not happen, but they still have to do what they do. So we proposed that there needed to be a psychological replacement for war, which would be international competitions, which would allow people who need the excitement of competition to do something actually useful for a change, constructive. So we thought, let's see which society can provide the best health care, which society can feed the most people, which society can house the poor comfortably, which society can come up with the most profound scientific advances. He thought the Olympics, which had been started, I think it's 1896, was the first Olympics, was not an adequate substitute for war because it was simply a symbolic displacement of war in which men from different nations got together and did physical things, sometimes against each other, but the end result was you wave your national flag and you say Forza Italia or USA all the way, and nothing has changed. If you could get people to compete for constructive things, they might actually then begin to develop new habits that have to do with addressing the world's problems. And he thought that international groups of citizens rather than governments should be organizing this. NGOs, what we call NGOs today, which were just starting at the time. He thought world fairs were silly for many of the same reasons. And he also says that, look, you're not going to get people to agree about anything because the systems of representation they bring are inherently incompatible because they're based on prior histories as well as habits. And so you have to be able to figure out how do you get people working together on things. Well, then he proposes there's some basic things that all people go through. Getting sick and dying, going hungry, housing, essentially. There are a few other things he talks about. That you have to start international cooperation from this most basic level of how do you address the needs of the poorest people in the world and secure the needs of the average citizen or subject, so that as you talk and learn from each other, a new habits form and consensus forms that would and there would be actual shareable values based on practical action. It is, for him, this is another application of how pragmatism would function in the real world. You don't change ideas and then change behavior. You change behavior and then ideas change along with them. This was something that Marxists in particular didn't like and were very critical of, as well as conservatives. So, let's see. Now, there is a downside to this, which is essentially we can then view James as part of the U.S. imperial project for the 20th century, the expansion of U.S. institutions and values internationally, and provides a justification for various presidents to do various things, because after all, the world would be much better if they just did things the way we do them. Because he's modeling these things based on the U.S. experience, on the assumption that the U.S. experience is an experience of pluralism and relativism, even though the rhetoric guiding the country at the time was not. That the world might learn from the United States in terms of how to handle difference, but first the United States had to learn from it, how to handle its own differences, which it hasn't yet. But there's also, and this is where I'll leave you with James, because I think it's really sort of central to where he was coming from. Total failure is our lot. Our business is to continue to fail in good spirits. It is the nature of life to be eaten by something. All of us are, at one point or another, are going to be eaten by something. That's just the way it is. And life, much of life is about, much of our emotions are about fear and desire and continuous interplay. And that we're not going to escape this because it is who we are, it's our existence. What critical thought he believed could do was provide us with a way in which fear could be channeled into something that would allow us to feel a little bit better about ourselves and our place in the world. This was in a sense his ultimate Pascalian wager. It's not that there's God, but maybe if we act as if we can do something, if we act as if we don't have to fail, maybe the rewards of that will outweigh any negative consequences of having an inaccurate and less than brutally realistic view of how the world works. Now, and he's operating in a society, well, Teddy Roosevelt was one of his students at Harvard, and he often used Teddy Roosevelt as an example of what was wrong with leadership in the United States and around the world, because Teddy Roosevelt believed that it was a dog-eat-dog world, kill or be killed. The law of Herod. You either kill or you get killed. And for James, that was perhaps a realistic, through human history, had been a realistic way of living. but it was also a dismal, disempowering way of living. So why not act as if there is an alternative, knowing that even if you're completely successful in everything you want to do, total failure still remains your lot. It's inescapable, and we'll leave it with there. So on Monday, we'll pick up with John Dewey, and on Wednesday, I'll wrap up Pragmatism with George Herbert Mead, and a more extensive discussion of the history of higher education in the United States and how Berkeley came to be Berkeley.